Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming today to learn a bit more about this fascinating piece of research that Julie and Dr. Julie Rugg and Dr. Alison Wallace have completed on property supply in the lower end of the English private rented sector. In 2018, the Nationwide Foundation funded the Centre for Housing Policy at the University of York to deliver a review of the private rented sector in England, and also an accompanying report into vulnerability in the private rented sector. If you'd like to see those, they're on our website. But coming out of this work really strongly was evidence about how precarious the lower end of the private rented sector is in terms of how it operates as a market. And given the reliance that we put on the private rented sector for housing a number of vulnerable people, we wanted to understand a bit more about this. So we were really pleased to fund this new research, which explores in more detail how landlords that supply homes at the lower end of the PRS operate their business and what this supply might look like in the future. The research has revealed an awful lot, I think more detail than we could have expected, and there is much to analyse and get our heads around. But ultimately, it tells us that the supply to the lower end is not particularly sustainable and is likely to contract. Because there is so much to cover in this from this research, we have 3 roundtables running this week. I think some of you will be coming to more than one, but today we're focusing on understanding small landlordism. And I will let Julie now tell you more about it. A couple of bits of housekeeping. It will have popped up that we are recording this. However, video isn't on, so you won't appear on the video. Just also to remind you that this is a public event, and therefore the content in the chat is public and will be put online afterwards. And we will have some questions and answers at the end. If you could pop your questions in the chat function, and we'll pick them up from there. So I think I've covered everything there, and now with pleasure I hand over to Julie.
Right, thanks very much. I hope you can all hear me well. I'm going to share my screen and get into the PowerPoint. Right, let's have a look. The beginning. So thanks very much to Lee for the introduction. As Lee sort of indicated, I'm going to be talking today about this recent research that's been funded by the Nationwide Foundation, which is looking at property supply at the lower end of the market. We wanted to kind of explore whether this supply of property was kind of sustainable. And to that end, we were asking landlords really about their kind of financial dealings and their continuing sort of financial management. We wanted to get a feel for whether landlords could really make it work at the bottom end of the market, the kind of models that they were using and the strategies that they were employing. Also to understand their kind of ongoing intentions for this part of the market. Details about how the research was undertaken is I've just sort of flashed up a kind of a connection there, but as Lee's indicated, it's also there on the Nationwide Foundation website. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the actual mechanics of how we did the research, because it's all there in the reports, and we've got quite a lot to talk about today. So much of what I'm going to reflect on today comes from 3 sources. First is a series of interviews we did. We interviewed 55 landlords during the summer of last year about their kind of experiences of letting, and almost all of those landlords were currently letting at the bottom end of the market. Some had exited the lower end of the market, and I can talk about, I'll be talking about that a bit later. We did some secondary analysis of the private landlord survey. That's a big survey that's undertaken by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and that's issued every few years. And we did some secondary analysis of that to get a feel for some figures. But we also did a very small survey as well on our own behalf with a landlord omnibus survey that's issued every quarter. So what I'm going to be doing really is to think about some selective findings from that research and inviting some of your questions and observations. And as Lee's indicated, perhaps if you could put those in the chat function, that would be great. So this session is really thinking about how we understand small landlordism. So I'm just going to admit somebody there. We know that the private rented sector is accommodating around 19% of all households, so it's contributing quite a lot to the housing market. We know that investment in the social rented sector has contracted, and households on lower income have little option but to rent privately. So if we're placing this quite heavy reliance on the private rented sector, I think it's really important to take time to understand who it is that we're relying on. And at the very least, I think we need to answer these 4 questions. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. How can we characterise small landlords in this part of the market? In what circumstances do they let to lower income tenants? Are their financial business models sustainable? And can we continue to rely on small landlords to accommodate lower income tenants? So 4 big questions there. If we're talking about the first question here, we're going to be thinking about definitions. And often when you choose to define something, how you define it depends very much on why you want a definition. And one of the things that we found is that the existing definitional kind of frameworks for understanding small landlords are simply not very satisfactory. So simply counting how many properties a landlord might have will tell you an awful lot about how many properties a landlord has without necessarily telling you very much about that landlord specifically. And again, asking landlords about whether they're interested in rental income or capital uplift is kind of like a little bit of an old-fashioned question. We really need to understand landlords in a much more sophisticated way. So what we did was we decided, rather than to think about landlord categories from the outset, we thought, let's just interview the landlords and see what comes out of that data. We did what's called a kind of a grounded approach, and we decided to define our categories depending on how landlords told us about what they did. Because we talked to the landlords in quite a lot of detail. We asked them about how they came to be landlords, asked them to tell us about their first property purchase, how they purchased it, then their next purchase, how they did that, and how they were approaching letting activity. So that kind of information gave us quite a good frame for kind of understanding how it might be better, more accurate to characterise landlords in a different way. And I think for us, there were 2 things in the definition that were really quite important. One was kind of getting a feel for whether landlords were wholly reliant on their rental income for their income and whether they were working. Because one of the things that really hasn't been looked at all is the relationship between landlords letting property and their own work. So that was quite an interesting thing to sort of look at. And we also wanted to understand the kind of the dynamics of being a landlord. And what was really great about the research was we interviewed landlords at all life stages, some who were very early in the market, very young. I think the youngest person was in their 20s, right through to people, I think the oldest landlord was in their 80s. So we got a really good, strong feel for how the dynamic of letting kind of works over the life course. So we integrated some of that into our, the way in which we approached how we did our analysis. So the characteristic, how we characterise landlords is we've put them into one of 4 categories. And here we're just talking about the kind of small landlordism. We're not talking about the bigger, more institutional landlords or local authorities or the housing associations that are also doing market rent, those kind of institutions and organisations. We're talking really specifically about individual landlords who might also be letting with their partner. So the first group, I think, that most people are familiar with are accidental landlords. So here we're talking about, my screen has stopped working, which is quite typical. You're going to have to sort of bear with me. My screen will come back. Accidental landlords. This is a group with no intention of being in the market over the medium or longer term. It's a category we're quite familiar with, but they're hugely important in policy terms because they actually bring quite a lot of property to the market. And one of the things that we found about them that was quite interesting was they were often letting to a family member or a friend. And it was also often the case that family member or friend was receiving help with their rent. So actually these kind of accidental landlords might be inadvertently in the market, but they might be playing quite a big role in letting to people in receipt of housing benefit. Those tenancies wouldn't be available to anybody else. So once that tenancy comes to an end, the landlords are generally likely to sell the property. But whilst they're in the market, often they're serving that kind of function. So that's sort of thinking about accidental landlords. A second group we've termed investment landlords. And this was a group that we defined principally in terms of their also having income from paid employment in addition to their letting income. As I've mentioned, it's quite interesting to sort of get to get a grip of landlords' relationships between their earnings and their lettings, and how they sort of married together. In some instances, landlords were using bonuses from work. They're using those sort of bonuses from work to sort of cross-subsidise their letting and paying with properties with cash deposits. So that's the kind of relationship that sometimes we were seeing. But there were three major reasons, I think, for these investor landlords to be in the letting market. The first major reason, again, which we're quite familiar with, are landlords simply wanting to augment their pension. So they might have had a patchy work relationship, in and out of different kinds of jobs in different kinds of places, and really didn't have much of a pension. So they wanted to invest so that when it came to retirement, they could draw another income. Other landlords weren't really seeing pension as being their focus. They just wanted somewhere to put spare capital. So they were lodging their spare capital into properties just as a safe place to put it, where nothing really radical was going to go wrong, they would hope. A third group, and I think this is a group that's quite interesting, are people who were investing in property as a means of saving for their children to get onto the property ladder later in life. So these people were investing in property, which they would then either gift to their children or sell and give that money to their children as their children came to adulthood and were looking for properties themselves. And these motivations could be really quite fluid. But for all of these landlords, the tendency was to plan for the longer term. So they were looking for a longer term investment. Their ideal was to have a tenant who was not really wanting to move, and they were looking for quite steady kind of rental income that paid the mortgage. So for a lot of the time, these landlords weren't necessarily accruing a great deal of additional income. The income they were taking was sufficient to pay the mortgage and accrue a little bit of sinking fund to deal with repairs and maintenance. So those landlords were quite happy for property to sort of wash its face. That was sufficient for them, and that was kind of what they were looking for. I think a final thing to say about this group, they're quite an interesting group, was the degree to which their professional competencies. So we're talking about landlords who are often in obviously quite well-paid jobs, but in professional jobs where they were working for local authorities, they were working in IT, some of them were working in property, some sort of, and they had an understanding of how spreadsheets worked, understanding of legalities, their responsibilities. So they were transferring those professional competencies into their letting and seeing their letting quite seriously as something that they were kind of project managing, often in quite a detailed kind of strategic way. And I think it's kind of important. We tend to see these landlords as amateurs, when in actuality, a lot of those landlords were carrying quite high-level competencies into their letting activity. The next group I want to look at, I'm going to keep checking to see whether this will move on, is portfolio landlords. And this is a group that tends not to be talked about, but is a really significant group in the PRS. And these are landlords who are full-time landlords who derive all of their income from their letting activity. And I think it's reasonable, I think it's not unhelpful to think about small landlordism as small business. And this is how these landlords were often operating, as small family businesses. Often they were working with their partner, so they would split responsibilities between them. One person would take responsibility for all the paperwork often. And a lot of portfolio landlords have a background in trades. They might be plasterers or builders, and have a really hands-on sort of understanding of property repair, management, maintenance, development. In some instances, we talk to people who had inherited property. So we're talking about here portfolios that were kind of two-generation portfolios, people working with their parents who'd accrued a portfolio and then were managing it with their adult children. So there we're talking about kind of small businesses, and these landlords were quite an interesting group because they needed to derive sufficient income from their property holdings to pay themselves a wage and to sort of maintain their family. So that was the sort of a group that had a very particular characteristics in terms of how they were operating. A fourth group I think is really quite important, and these were kind of business landlords, and these were bigger landlords in terms of financial holdings, but their approach to letting was nested within their other kind of business activities. So these were landlords who might own multiple businesses, not just letting. So they had letting and other kinds of businesses, not necessarily property related, where sometimes the profit from that business might go into their property holdings and help to pay for their portfolio expansion. So these landlords, unlike the portfolio landlords who were often very hands-on and that spent a lot of time in their properties working with tenants and doing property refurbishment and turning over tenancies, business landlords often were employing other people to manage their portfolio in terms as letting agents, or they directly employed management crews to go in and do repairs and maintenance. So often we're talking about high net worth individuals who were running their lettings almost in a CEO capacity. They were very familiar with their properties on a spreadsheet, and they spent a lot of time reviewing the market for new business opportunities in terms of locations to purchase. So that's kind of quite a fast gallop through the 4 types that we're looking at. And you can understand almost immediately that actually each of those 4 types gives us a slightly different set of questions to answer about how those different landlords operate in the market and what their responses to different market interventions might be. I'm going to, no, I'm sorry about, oh, here we go. And here's a kind of like a dynamic, and this dynamic, it sort of indicates how landlords might move between these characteristics. So we have some accidental landlords who actually quite like letting property and decide to sort of invest further and maybe grow their portfolios. Some landlords we know in employment who on retirement might use their retirement pot to invest in property and become portfolio landlords full time. So there's the dynamic element in there quite strongly. So the next question I'm going to ask is, what are the circumstances in which landlords let to lower income households? Now this next table I'm going to show you, thankfully it does work, so I'm pleased about that, sort of asks that question: in what circumstances are landlords letting to tenants on lower income? And the question asks which of these statements best describes your current practice. And I think it's quite interesting to go through these 4 kind of categories that we've got in this table here. 44% of landlords responding to this, so there's about 800 odd kind of responses, said that they never knowingly let to somebody receiving universal credit. About a quarter said that they would let to somebody on universal credit, but they wouldn't change their management practices. They were tolerant of people on universal credit, but they would just manage them as any other tenant. And around 10% of respondents said they would actively cater for the housing benefit market. And another 16% said it kind of depended. And I think and I'll come on to the dependent group a bit in a minute. It's worth saying that the 4 landlord types that I've described didn't fall neatly into those kind of 4 categories. It wasn't the case that certain types of landlord had certain types of attitude. They did very much sort of like, they ran across the board in terms of these different preferences. But landlords, I think it's interesting to think about the landlords who are completely averse to letting to tenants receiving housing benefit, because there's been a huge amount of discussion and debate recently about sort of no DSS and the fact that some landlords just won't let to people in receipt of housing benefit. And here we can sort of dig down a little bit into the reasons why this might be the case. And I think we saw 3 kind of interesting, well, not too interesting, we saw 3 kind of attitudes amongst those kinds of landlords. First, some of the landlords were letting property that simply was not at that price point. They were letting property at the middle of the market where people in receipt of benefits simply wouldn't be able to afford that level of rent. So it's naive to think that properties are all ranged at a similar kind of price point. Some landlords had multiple properties at multiple different price points, and they say, yes, those are the properties that are lower rental properties in different kinds of locations. They're my housing benefit lets. These are the properties, and often they were properties that landlords themselves had lived in. They were properties with higher specification in nicer places and were able to attract a higher level of rent because they were in higher demand locations. So that's how landlords viewed their kind of lettings. So the rents they were charging for those properties often were much higher than the local housing allowance rate, and landlords saw no reason to be letting those properties at below what they considered to be the market rate. Second, some landlords simply didn't want to deal with housing benefit administration because being in receipt of housing benefit made a tenant a different kind of tenant. They were often not able necessarily to pay rent up front. They had to pay rent in arrears, and as we've said, the rent is capped at the LHA rate. So some landlords have no reason to change their management practices to accommodate that kind of tenant. It just made it difficult to sort of run their management spreadsheets when they had people that were paying at a different sort of on a different basis to other tenants, and they saw that as just unnecessary. They didn't need to go down that line. The third group of landlords honestly did see tenants receiving benefits personally problematic. In their view, if you receive benefit, it's because there was a problem personally with how you were living your life, and nothing's going to change their attitude to that. That was their view. They were very fixed in that view. On some instances, it was a minority view, it must be said, but some landlords simply saw if you were in receipt of benefit, you were going to bring other problems with you, and they didn't really want to be involved in that. They saw it was too much of a gamble. But from our perspective, it's really more important to look at the landlords who were accepting tenants in receipt of housing benefit or in receipt of lower income. And we'll recall the stat that I gave you early on from the private landlord survey. 48% of landlords had no issue with letting to somebody in receipt of benefit. But I think we've got to distinguish a little bit between the landlords in this bigger grouping here. We've got what we call, as we've got in this group, the housing benefit tolerant landlords, who have no issue with taking people in receipt of housing benefit, but they were treated pretty much as any other tenant in terms of the landlord requiring the rent to be paid in advance and requiring, if any problems came up with the benefit, the tenant's responsibility to sort that out. We had some landlords who were had what we might call legacy lettings. So they had very, very long-term lettings sometimes, and would continued letting to that particular individual household, irrespective of what happened to that household. So there was a kind of a loyalty going on that, yeah, okay, there might be a relationship breakdown, there might be in and out of work, didn't really matter. There was a relationship with that household, and the landlord supported the household, even if at sometimes they were receiving housing benefit. That didn't really matter. But we had a big group of landlords who kind of said, you know what, it doesn't matter to me if people receive housing benefit, provided they pay the rent. It's their business how they pay the rent in terms of how they make up that money, providing I get it on time every month. I don't really care how those tenants receive, or if those tenants get any help with paying the rent. So that was quite a big group in there as well. But it was really important for those landlords to see that those tenants weren't any different. And that's the really important thing. It was okay to be on housing benefit, providing you didn't look any different in terms of how you paid your rent. We also had some tenants who were, some landlords who were specifically targeting housing benefit tenants. And on this table here, we've got around 10% of landlords who say, their tenants include people in receipt of universal credit, and they're specifically happy to change their management practices to accommodate that group. So they're happy to wait maybe a period of 5 weeks for the first payment to be made. They're happy for the payments to be made in advance. And often they're quite happy also to advise the tenant on their benefit application and to help them support the tenant through all of that. And it's interesting thinking about that group, and I'm going to talk about them in a bit more detail later on in the week. So there's 2 further sessions after this one. So I'm not going to talk about them a huge amount, but I'm going to sort of say just one further thing, and that is that those landlords tended to distinguish between 3 types of tenant at the bottom of the market. So they were thinking about tenants who maybe were benefit supported, so that they were quite happy to let to tenants who were in work, but might receive universal credit to help top up their income so they could pay the rent. Some landlords, that was a group they were happy with. Other landlords were happier with tenants who are wholly benefit dependent. So we're talking about people with caring responsibilities like lone parents, or whether it's a household with a long-term sickness or disability, or pensioner households, because in their view, actually, those people's economic circumstances didn't change. They were likely to be fairly steady, and the benefit income would come in a very steady way. There was also a third group who were much more actively targeting what might be regarded as vulnerable tenants who had experiences of homelessness, mental health difficulties, and some kinds of problematic behaviours, but where it was likely that the landlord would be able to secure a direct payment of housing benefit because those recipients fell into what was called the Tier 1 category. So landlords were looking at those 3 kind of options at the bottom of the market, and they were strategically deciding which of those kinds of tenants they wanted to accommodate. I'm going to move on to the next bit and think about landlords' business and financial models. Now, we went into the research in a bit of a naive way in some ways, thinking that we'd arrive at some very tidy sums that told us about how landlords were purchasing properties, how they set their rents and what yields they were looking for, all of that kind of thing. But in actuality, landlords' financial dealings were messier, not in the sense that they were messy and chaotic. The massive variety in landlord types which I've just described made it very, very hard to say, actually, this is kind of how it works, because landlords were often bringing other things to the table, which meant it was very hard to compare one landlord to another. So the messiness was really about the very, very wide diversity that we found between the landlords that we were talking to. I mean, in particular, one of the things I think that's quite important is understanding how many landlords had property that was not mortgaged, so they owned their property outright. And again, if you're thinking about financial stability and robustness, factoring in the fact that some landlords owned quite a lot of property that had no debt attached to it is really quite important to sort of understand. We can see from this table here, which again comes from the BDRC survey, about a quarter of landlords who said that they actively accepted universal credit tenants had all of their property was owned outright. So you might sort of presume that this kind of landlord was fairly kind of like financially robust because they had no debt against the property that they were letting. So this is something that kind of also needed to be taken into account. Our qualitative survey did include a number of landlords who were in that group, that included landlords that were completely unmortgaged, and some of them had just simply inherited property that no longer had any debt attached to it, and some had really assiduously paid down their mortgage debt because that was their kind of preference. That's how they wanted to manage their holdings. And landlords' attitudes to finance was actually remarkably personal. So it's very easy to say, oh, this is the financially efficient way to do it, and all this way. But actually, landlords' attitudes to how they managed their portfolios financially really depended very much on their views about debt and their attitudes towards mortgage debt in particular. There was a particular financial model for portfolio growth that was described to us on more than one occasion. So after a couple of times hearing it, you think, that's quite interesting, but actually a lot of landlords said, actually, this is the standard way of kind of growing a portfolio. And it's quite interesting to reflect on this particular model because it helps us understand a couple of things. So this is the typical kind of story I'm going to describe. An individual decides to become a landlord, and often they were using initial startup capital through remortgaging their own family home. So they might remortgage their own home because it might have accrued quite a lot, as house price inflation, and realise some capital, and then they use that capital as deposit cash on more than one property if that money was enough. They'd put down property. Often they were targeting property that was a long way below market value. So it made very little sense to them to buy property at the top end of the market. They were looking at property that they could add value to, often because of its condition. So they might buy a property, let's just make up a figure, they might buy property at, say, £60,000. So we're talking about somewhere like, I don't know, Scunthorpe, £60,000, really poor quality property, that it was then the landlord would invest in it to bring that property up to a new value, which they would then remortgage on. So they'd start off with a mortgage at 60, invest in the property, and then remortgage it maybe at 85 or 90 because the quality of the investment, to refurbish the property brought up the value. So they'd recoup the deposit, perhaps make £15,000 worth in profit, and then use that £15,000 as deposit on the next property. So you can see there's a kind of a tumble through, kind of a remortgaging going on as landlords were using money to build the portfolio. As they were refurbishing properties, they were retaining them on interest-only mortgages, which kept the investment level low. So they were releasing the property in good value and not good value, in good condition back onto the market as a rental property, and it needed to be in good condition because that was really necessary to the remortgaging. But for this kind of group of landlords, there could be quite a high level of tolerance for mortgage debt. Many had very high loan to mortgage ratios against their properties, and were quite happy with that because they saw the money was there to use. They needed to kind of reuse and remortgage, and that was the best way for them to be managing their portfolios. Other landlords might use a similar kind of model, but their kind of priority was to pay down as fast as possible. So those landlords were seeking to, often they could be quite frugal in their own personal finances, because their objective was to arrive at a portfolio that had no mortgage finance attached to it. And then they felt that was the point at which they could enjoy their rental income. But all landlords, irrespective of their attitude towards debt, it was really interesting thinking about their strategies for how to make it work at the bottom of the market. And their view was to make it work at the bottom of the market, there was no point at all in seeking to maximise the rent, because people's income wouldn't tolerate that. There was no point in pushing the rent up because people couldn't pay it. And if people couldn't pay the rent, then they would have to leave, and then you'd have to refurbish the property to attract another tenant, and that all cost money. So a lot of landlords were looking at ways in which they could minimise their costs. So setting the rent judiciously was right at the top of the list of things to do. Setting it at slightly below the market value, the local rental value, was a good approach, because it meant you had a bigger choice of tenants to choose from, and you could choose a good tenant likely to stay for longer. Also, some landlords, and it was quite interesting hearing landlords talk about this, their view was actually if you don't put up the rent every month, then chances are the tenant's going to stay. And chances are if the tenant's thinking of moving, they might have to see an increase in their rent if they're moved. And so there was a sense in which you could trap a tenant into sort of paying a slightly lower level rent because they're really not able to move in the same way. So it's something I feel quite ambivalent about, whether it's a good thing to be trapping tenants in that way, but that's something that they also talked about. But certainly they were very, very concerned to minimise turnover, and the best way to do that was to keep tenants happy. And so much of what I'm saying at the moment, I'm completely aware of, runs counter to all the narratives of how we talk about the market. But here we're talking about how to make the bottom of the market work, and making it work was about keeping the costs low through keeping tenants happy and maintaining tenancies for as long as possible. None of the landlords interviewed said that minimising expenditure on repairs and maintenance, it was simply not business sense to do that, because it meant the tenant was more likely to leave, and it was bad for the property. So a lot of the landlords that we were talking to were very much concerned to make sure that their properties were at good standard. But again, I absolutely admit at this stage in the game that we were talking to the more professional portfolio and business landlords and more experienced investor landlords. So there are that landlord group in the market, and that's who we were talking to. So overall, the majority of landlords we talked to were kind of financially stable and were making a satisfactory rate of return for themselves, given their investment, given the time they were dedicating to their holdings. The taxation changes had some impact on profitability. So some of the landlords who we were talking to were giving really serious consideration to their options because they'd been hit quite hard by the tax changes. Some landlords had simply stopped expanding. They decided there was very little point in expanding, because to expand would put them in a tax bracket which would increase their tax burden. There was very little point in doing that. So the taxation change came as a break to some landlords, and that was quite interesting. Some of the newer landlords were already purchasing into non-personal sort of like holdings, so they weren't as affected by the changes as you might imagine. I want to just sort of mention the landlords who weren't so financially stable, because I think it's worth just indicating why we found that to be the case. And it was a small number, maybe a small handful of landlords who we saw were in real financial difficulty. And these were landlords who were inexperienced. So these were landlords who'd maybe only started letting property in the last 2-3 years. The landlords had chosen badly. So they'd chosen property where they thought they could buy well and make a real sort of improvement in property quality, but actually the surveys, they hadn't really paid sufficient attention to surveys. The property quality was much worse than they expected, and they were stuck with a property that was impossible to let. Some of the landlords in this kind of small group were self-employed. Their self-employment income wasn't very good. They had 1 or 2 properties that weren't great. They'd maybe come across unfortunately happened on a tenant who wasn't great in paying the rent, and all of that combined together to make for a very precarious kind of situation. But again, I've got to stress that this was quite a small number amongst the group we spoke to. We did ask landlords if they would advise other people to get into the letting business. It's quite an interesting question. And we had surprising kinds of responses, because the response we got most of the time wasn't, you can't make money in this business. Most landlords said you can make a good business in letting property, but I would advise people not to do this for these other reasons. So often landlords were cautioning other people to say, you know what, these are the reasons I wouldn't get into this business, and these are the reasons I'm going to talk about a bit further down. Because those are the reasons that feed into the final question I'm going to ask, which is, can we continue to rely on small landlords to accommodate lower income tenants? So we know that in answering this question, we need to take into account that these landlords are a remarkably varied group, but also at the same time, for a number of different reasons and in a number of different ways, they are contributing to meeting need at the lower end of the market. However, market sentiment is shifting, and we have to bear that into account. So this is a sort of a graphic that kind of indicates percentage growth in PRS households, and which was underlined by the last English housing survey, that the private rented sector is contracting. We have a smaller number of landlords coming into the market at the moment. I think we can see that in some regions that this part of the market has shrunk quite substantially. And this table that I'm showing you, this graph, you have to bear in mind that we've seen a 4% increase in population. So this is quite radical or quite marked contraction. This next table I'm going to show you asks landlords about their future plans, and just, I don't know why, I think it was interesting for me to sort of compare 3 different groups rather than looking at all of the landlord responses. And what we see, I've compared landlords with 1 to 4 properties, so quite, you know, landlords with quite small holdings, landlords with 25 plus properties irrespective of their letting preferences, and landlords who indicate that housing benefit LHA tenants are definitely a group that they would let to. And the landlords were asked if they were going to increase, decrease the number of properties, keep that properties the same, sell their properties and leave the business altogether, or whether they hadn't made any plans. And if you take a kind of like an aggregate of responses in terms of landlords' desires to increase or decrease, we find that the majority of landlords are going to be leaving the sector. And that includes the larger landlords, but also the landlords who are specifically looking to meet need in the housing benefit market or at the lower end of the sector. We know that new entrants aren't coming to the market at the same kind of rate. In 2010, 22% of landlords had been letting for 3 years or less. Oh, I'm sorry, my battery's going. In 2018, that figure had gone right down to just under 10%. It had half. I'm just going to have to. You can see we've had multiple technical difficulties today. It's been that kind of day. Right, okay. So the number of landlords coming to the market are simply not enough to replace the number of landlords who are looking to leave the market. And I'm just going to finish by talking about some of the reasons why landlords are stepping back. Firstly, I think the context for letting property is simply much less benign than it used to be. I think landlords would be disingenuous if they didn't think that actually they'd enjoyed some quite beneficial sort of circumstances for growing their portfolios over the last few years, certainly over the last 20, 30 years. One of the landlords that we'd interviewed had gone to the bank pre-global financial crisis for a small loan because they wanted to replace their kitchen, and they came out with money for 3 buy-to-let mortgages. So there was that feeling at that time that this money was massively readily available, and a lot of landlords were growing their portfolios on the basis of that kind of energy to sort of expand. And we're not living in that world anymore. But landlords are stepping back from the market. And I think there's 6 reasons that are important. And I'm going to put these reasons up, but with an indicative quotation. So these are the words of landlords talking through some of these reasons. I think the first reason, the really important reason we can't ignore really, is just simple demography. Landlords are aging out of the market. I'll kind of indicate that we've got a quotation here from landlords. It was a landlord couple that we interviewed that were in their 70s. There was absolutely no reason for them to expand their holdings, and they were beginning to sell. So we've got a whole group of kind of baby boomer landlords who are exiting the market simply because they're getting older and they no longer, well, they're simply not going to be around for very much longer. A second sort of big reason sits around the finances. So some landlords were hit really, really badly by the taxation changes. And in their view, those taxation changes had massively reduced the profitability of letting, and they were simply unwilling to pay additional tax. So these landlords were stepping back because they didn't see it as worth their time. So that was one of the reasons for stepping back. Another big reason sits around what I would term, and landlords didn't use this term, but regulatory burden. So in the past few years, the list of regulatory changes we're asking landlords to talk about is very, very long. And landlords didn't have an issue with being regulated. And I think I really want to stress this. They had no problem with being regulated and doing their job properly. The issues that they had was the tone of some of the regulation, which they felt was sometimes very punitive and quite aggressive. So they felt sometimes the cost of making a mistake could be very high in their view. So one of the landlords was talking about the costs of making a mistake around deposits, where you might make an honest mistake about lodging a deposit and then find that the cost of doing that would wipe out the profit from the whole year. So they were seeing that some of that regulatory burden was falling very heavily, and they were wondering whether they wanted to continue dealing with that. And that kind of attaches to another thing, which is kind of hassle. And it's possible to be quite unsympathetic with this. I mean, everybody's job is a hassle. But some of the landlords, considering the kind of returns that they were getting, their view was that actually, compared with being a landlord, maybe having premium bonds was a better bet. Because actually, okay, it might not be great returns, but they're not calling you all the time so that you need to come and fix the boiler, and they're not giving you their kind of emotional burden of supporting the tenant. All of the things that landlords felt that they had to sort of contribute to their letting were absent if you were thinking about a much more neutral sort of investment. So the hassle for a lot of landlords was quite a big reason why they were thinking about moving out of the market, particularly as they were getting older. They simply didn't have the energy for it anymore. I think that was quite a big thing for some of the landlords that we talked to. But they were also stepping back from the housing benefit market as well. And I'm going to talk about this in a lot more detail later in the week. But universal credit was for some landlords just too much of a thing, too much of a change for them to bear. And I think there were two big bits about it. First, the end of direct payments, which some landlords saw as hugely problematic and a big contributor to tenants falling into rent arrears. But the second thing, which was actually landlords felt more, was the failure, the breaking of that relationship that they might have had with the local authority, housing benefit team, where they might know somebody on the team, whether that team knew the landlord. They might also all know the tenant, where actually that relationship was quite close, and there was a working relationship there that the landlords understood and actually felt quite valued in that relationship. Universal credit has simply taken an awful lot of that away. But the final thing I want to talk about is about risk. And one of the things that has come with COVID is the suspension of Section 21, and that's really concentrated landlords' attentions on where risk sits in the market. And a lot of landlords are reviewing their letting strategies and thinking about how much risk they want to bear at the minute. So they see the removal of Section 21 as the removal of a guaranteed way of dealing with problematic tenants with very high levels of rent arrears or antisocial behaviour problems that are causing problems in a neighbourhood. But they're also seeing the removal of Section 21 also as kind of influencing their desire and willingness to let at the bottom end of the market, where they might see more problematic behaviours and where they might see reliance on benefits that might lead to rent arrears. So landlords were also thinking about whether all of that kind of risk was kind of stacking up for them. And for all of these reasons together, I think we're going to see a reduction in the supply of property to the lower end of the market. So I'm going to end there. This particular session is really focused in on landlords themselves to look at what landlord supply looks like. What I want us to sort of end with, if it's at all possible, is to think that landlords as a group, it's really, really hard to generalise about them. Landlords are very, very diverse as a group. We've got a lot of variation in landlord motivations. Landlords are stepping back, in my view. They are stepping back from the housing benefit market, but that's in the context of a general withdrawal from the market as well. We've got a lot of baby boomer landlords who are just heading out of the sector. They're aging out of letting, and they're not being replaced at the same scale by new landlords coming to the market. So I'm going to leave it at there. I can see there's a number of chats. which might be interesting to think through. So I'm going to hand us back to Lee, who's going to facilitate some further kind of discussion. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Julie. Really fascinating stuff and great. I've really enjoyed hearing some more detail on those points. We do have quite a few questions, so I am going to take you through them and try and group some of them together. And I'm going to ask you to keep answers short so we can get through as many as possible in the next 10 minutes. So there's a couple of questions that were about what landlords, the shape of landlords, and Charles has asked about how many properties smaller landlords own and how many were leveraged. Did you have a figure on that?
Well, it's very hard to sort of make that judgment because a lot of the landlords didn't necessarily see that the properties like this and this is like this. Actually, they were thinking about their holdings together often, rather than thinking about properties individually. And landlords' approaches were very, very different. They're all at very, very different stages. So it's really hard to answer that question because it's not really the way that landlords saw their holdings necessarily.
Thank you. And Kate's asked a question about overlaps between portfolio landlords and letting agents. What was the relationship, and did you see any patterns with the use of letting agents?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really talk about letting agents very much there, but letting agents actually played a surprisingly big role in the housing lettings at the bottom end of the market. I'd kind of presumed that landlords' rents would, wouldn't be sufficient to be able to pay a letting agent to be involved in the letting. But actually, some portfolio landlords were really quite happy to use letting agents because they saw letting agents as a guaranteed way of getting all of the tenancy regulation right. If they were less confident about dealing with that side of things, but they were really great at plastering and electrics and hands-on and doing that, then using a letting agent was a really good way of ensuring that all of the legalities of the tenancy were right. So some landlords were quite reliant on letting agents for that sort of side of things.
Lovely, thanks. And you touched on the issues of universal credit, where you spoke about the issues of universal credit, particularly around direct payments. Graham was asking about whether there is any difference between the attitudes towards tenants who might still be on housing benefits and therefore landlords getting direct payments, and those who have moved to universal credit. Were there different patterns there?
Yeah, I mean, some of the landlords that we talked to were very, very familiar with local housing allowance and worked with it, and they'd all of their sort of like operational sort of practices were based on local housing allowance and how that worked and their relationship with the local authority. So I think there were two things that were problematic. For some landlords, just simply the transition to universal credit was hugely problematic, and some landlords reported accruing quite a lot of rent arrears with their more problematic tenants, who they found very, very difficult to support through that period, because the tenants didn't know they didn't understand what was happening, but also the landlord was finding it very hard to access ways to help the tenant because they couldn't access the tenant's kind of benefit claim. So it was really hard for those landlords, and they were very bitter about being left out of the loop of consultation about how to help tenants through that process. So in terms of universal credit kind of now, there are some landlords whose practices are, yeah, actually universal credit's the thing, let's get on with it, and we'll start from this point. So and a couple of times I said, we're not carrying any baggage here. This is how we're going to operate. We're going to work with universal credit, and this is how we're going to make it work. So we've got some variation in sort of attitudes there. So universal credit per se, some landlords were really quite, we're just getting on with working with it. But I think there were the landlords who were much likely to be looking for, tier 1 direct payments. That was the way they were working with it. They were looking to secure direct payments from the system, I think.
Great, thank you. A question about your methodology and how you recruited the landlords who participated.
Yeah, landlord recruitment, really hard. So we used 2 or 3 different things. We worked with some local authorities who managed to put us in touch with some landlords. That was good. We addressed a couple of LHA kind of events to ask if landlords wanted to be involved. But the bigger group was landlords who came to us via a call out on Property 118. Now, that was quite an interesting sort of way of doing things, because our first sort of response was we're really going to get a certain type of landlord from Property 118. But actually, as we undertook the interviews and talked to different people, that wasn't necessarily the case. We had a big variation in the kinds of landlords we were talking to. So people coming through that route included people with just 1 or 2 properties, and also the people with bigger portfolios. So I'm quite happy with that kind of way of recruiting. But I think the big problem that we had not the big problem, one of the issues that we've had is being able to sort of like really drill down to the very bottom end of the market. So we're talking about supply to the lower end of the market. In no way, shape or form will we be able to deal with landlords operating much more criminally with more malign intent at the very bottom of the market, because these landlords would be very difficult to sort of secure interviews with. It's some research that we're going to be doing in the future, but as part of this project, we weren't able to access that kind of landlord.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks. Thanks for clarifying that. There's been a few comments around the quality of property in the private rented sector. Leslie's point is that if public money is going into property, there should be appropriate checks to ensure it meets minimum standards, and how smaller landlords can often just react to repairs and only dealing with reported repairs. And Carol pointing out that smaller landlords rely on their properties as their pension, so it would be counterintuitive to ignore any repairs needed. We didn't hugely go into detail on quality in this one, but I just wondered if there's anything you wanted to comment. I think we noted how the response you were getting from the landlords that you spoke with and surveyed painted a different picture from some of the things that we believe about the lower end of the private rented sector and the lower quality of that part of the sector. So I wondered if you had any views, thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. I think that certainly, I think we'd gone in with questions about property quality, but we were finding actually it's a really hard question to frame in some ways, because we also know from sort of research that's been done previously that landlords' views about the quality of their property don't necessarily match up with an objective survey of quality. So it's kind of like, it's very difficult to sort of go from how landlords said, you know, this is the quality and this is how it is, because how do you describe it? It's really quite difficult. I think we need to do some separate research, and I think the separate research we need to do really looks at why property quality might be quite poor in certain parts of the market, because I think we're presumed that it's the PRS, so it's going to be poor quality. I think it's 23% of the sector has got lower quality, but actually there's remarkable variation within that 23%. So some parts of the country that's a lot lower, and some parts it's higher. Quality amongst housing multiple occupation can be quite high. The most worrying statistic, and I think this comes out from the new survey that's just come out, is how poor a quality of property there is in houses that have been lived in by older people for really long periods of time. So what we really need to understand is, why are these longer term tenancies with older tenants, why are they in such poor condition? What is the issue there? So I think we've really got to unpick this a little bit, rather than presuming that, yeah, okay, it's private landlords, they don't invest in their property. We've got to understand the circumstances in which poor quality is happening, because then we can be more effective about how we deal with it. Because at the minute, I would argue, we don't quite understand what it's about.
And that mirrors one of your findings in the PRS review, that the longer somebody had been in a property was often where there was worse conditions, which we always found quite an interesting finding. Just skipping back to some of the questions. Ruth has asked about whether there's evidence from similar sized international PRS markets and the impact of bringing in reforms like increased security of tenure, and whether you're aware of whether that led to landlords leaving and an uptick in homelessness. Ruth's in Scotland and comments that she doesn't think that's been seen in Scotland, but if you had any knowledge of other markets.
Yeah, I think we have to look at Scotland quite carefully because it's a market that's very similar to our own. It's got a very similar history to our own. I think it's quite hard to transfer understanding of what might happen in different places with a whole different culture for renting. And a whole different understanding of what renting is about and what it means, because actually it would be too much like comparing apples and pears. I think with the Scottish experience, it's really kind of interesting to understand what change might look like and what might drive change. And I think there's research ongoing at the moment, which will be really interesting to see how that unfolds. So it's quite hard, I think, at the minute to say, actually, this is what's happening, because we know that a lot of tenancies are quite long term. And if a landlord's got very few tenancies, then making a decision then takes time because they'll wait until the tenancy finishes, then they'll make their next decision. So it takes time for an impact to sort of follow out in terms of landlords' decision making. I mean, one of the things that comes out of this, the notion that landlords are leaving kind of en masse, yes, certainly kind of taken together, but each landlord is only maybe selling one property a year. So, I mean, it all adds up, obviously, but thinking that decision making can take a long time for it all to unfold. So I think looking at Scotland very carefully is going to be really important.
Yes, and the research that you mentioned, Indigo House, is looking into this with funding from us, and so keep an eye on results from that when they come out. Now we are coming into the last minute. There are a few more questions. Joe's moved us on to kind of what should we do about this? Should the government be stepping in and supporting new entrants into this market if other landlords are leaving, and how minimal the chances of new landlords coming in? And I think, Joe, one of the things that we need to do is think about how do we use this information? What does this information tell us? There's 2 more sessions coming up this week. One is targeted at what does this mean for local authorities, and on Thursday, the role of housing benefit in shaping property supplies to the lower end of the market. We'll go into much more detail. If you're signed up to those, brilliant. If you can't make it on the day, as with this one, the recording will be going out and available to you all on the Nationwide Foundation's website. Julie, is there any I'm really sorry for the questions that we didn't get to. Thank you so much for your engagement and your questions there, some really good ones. And actually there's one I'm going to leave you with, Julie, from Eddie, which was government's about to commission a landlord survey. What should they try to find out about landlords that you weren't able to? Which I think is a great question. If you've got a really quick answer to that one.
Oh, what would they find out from oh no, there's too many things. I'm sorry. It's like suddenly open a sweet shop and think, there you go. I can't do that. I'm sorry. It's a great question. Great question. And I think that it's so often the case that you try and find the answers, especially in housing. You try to find the answers to one question, you end up opening a can of worms to all sorts of other questions. So we'll be continuing to work with Julie and other stakeholders to think about how to use this information, and we encourage you in your roles and in your worlds to do the same. So on that note, I may see you again on the sessions later this week. Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you very much. Thank you to all for attending today, and thank you for your questions.